All right, y'all. So, what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you a lecture over chapter 7. And this isn't intended to be a full lecture. I'm not trying to make you understand everything in the chapter. I'm trying to give you an overview or an introduction to it. So, if there's something you don't follow from here, remember, we're going to do the lessons in class. This is just a starting point. So, chapter 7 is called A More Perfect Union. And what we're looking at with this is the idea that America has gotten what it wanted. It's declared independence from Britain, it's won the Revolutionary War, and now it is ready to live on its own. So imagine when you move out from your parents' house, how different everything is going to be. You're going to go from getting their food, getting them to pay for your bills, having them pay your rent, probably putting gas in your car and fixing it when you need it, to you're on your own. You've got to do everything you need to do done yourself. That's kind of where America is at this point. America's got its freedom, but now they have to figure out what to do with it. How do we make 13 different colonies decide they're going to work together when they don't have a common enemy anymore? When there's not one person bearing down and trying to take them all over? That's going to be the problem. America was defined, it started from the idea that they didn't want to be part of Britain anymore. But when they get that, there's differences all across America. We looked at it. We looked at the difference between the New England colonies and the middle colonies and the southern colonies, the way they made money, what they thought about things, how they lived. All those differences really stack up. They really matter. So now that America is free, someone's got to figure out how to keep America together. And that's what chapter 7 is going to be about. The idea of more perfect union is all about how do we make it work? How do we make it work better than it did underneath England, and then how it did after the war was over and America was just kind of, all right, what do we do now? So, chapter 7 is going to start off with lesson 1. And what lesson 1 is going to deal with is the idea of the Articles of Confederation. So after America gets free from Britain, America is going to create a constitution, a government. And they're going to set it off this thing called the Articles of Confederation. And it's weak. And if you think about it, it makes sense that they would want a weak government. The American colonials had started off underneath a strong, powerful king who had a lot of armies and a lot of power, and he could pretty much do anything he wanted. They didn't want to have to live with that again. So they wanted to set up a very weak government to follow. And what they did was they built this Articles of Confederation. And it allowed the states to have whatever freedoms they wanted, but that's going to cause some issues because everyone is so free, they start going in their own directions. They start saying things like, I'm not going to pay taxes because they weren't really being forced to. They started saying, I'm not going to support this or that. The only thing that the Articles of Confederation really allowed the national government to do is to raise some taxes and to go to war if they needed it. So that's really it. They could go to war, they could talk to other countries. They actually didn't have a great way to raise taxes, so it was really hard for them to make money anyway. States had to volunteer to put that money out. So basically, you can see where this would be a bad government. We use our government for all kinds of things in our country today. That government was so weak it wasn't able to build roads. If a state wanted a road, they had to build their own road. Now, what's going to happen is the Articles of Confederation, basically every state is a country on its own. There's no way to add new states. There's no way for the Articles of Confederation government to really run things. And in very few years, they're going to go through 10 or more people running it. So basically, they're going to get someone that's going to try to be in charge of the Articles of Confederation. They're not going to do very well. They're going to get booted out. Someone else is going to take it over. And again, and again, and again. Now, what this is going to lead to is it's going to make Americans start realizing we got to change something. This government's not going to work. And if it's not going to work, either we're going to have to accept that this country that we fought for in the Revolution is going to go away, or we're going to have to make a stronger government. And that stronger government is what's going to lead us into lesson 2. Lesson 2 is called Forging a New Constitution. So when we say something is being forged, what we're saying is it's being built, it's being created. And They're forging this Constitution. They're not thinking of it as writing it. They're not thinking of it as just the final draft of it. They are building it. They are building it from the ground up. It's going to have very little in common with the Articles of Confederation. They're just basically going to say, Articles of Confederation, it's too weak, it's not going to work, it's going to get us killed in the long run, or we're going to fall apart in the long run. Let's just start all the way over. Let's clear the drawing board. So, some issues are going to cause the articles to finally get thrown away completely. One of them is going to be a depression, not sad depression, economic depression. Basically, people are going to stop making and spending money so much. There's going to be a rebellion in America where a person decides they're going to fight the government and they're not going to pay their taxes. It's a guy named Shea. And what's going to happen is that's going to be a wake-up call for Americans that want their entire country to be good and realize that if we don't do something, everybody's going to start doing that. And then the final one is there's a tension over slavery. Slavery was an issue in America before America was America. People didn't like it, people wanted it, and they argued about it a lot. The Quakers, who again, only real good guys I can think of in American history, at this early part at least, are going to form the first American anti-slavery society at this point. And when they do, basically what they're looking for is they're looking to end slavery across the country. But they don't have that much power. They've got power in Pennsylvania though, and eventually they're going to set up a deal where people in Pennsylvania are going to be gradually freed from slavery. And they're going to try to set Pennsylvania up as a model state for the rest of the country to look at and say, all right, we can do this. That was a tangent. I just like talking about the Quakers. But what we get is this depression, this rebellion, all this tension over slavery. It's going to make people decide once and for all, we have to have a better constitution. We have to have a better government. We have to have something that tells the states how they can act and makes them work together so that they can get things done. There's going to be two plans. One of them is going to be a Virginia plan. And the Virginia plan is going to be a strong national government. It's going to be all about, we've got one government that's got a lot of control. Virginia was very populated at the time. There were a lot of people living there. So for Virginians, this plan, what they wanted was they wanted power to go to the states that had the most people. And I think you can see why. Virginia had the most people. So they wanted the states with more people to have more power. Makes sense. The New Jersey plan, which was a much smaller state, they wanted a moderate national government. They wanted the government to be strong, but not so strong that it could take over, not so strong that people had to worry about it. So, by weakening that government and setting things up the way that New Jersey wanted, they were basically looking at, let's go ahead and make sure that we don't make a strong national government and that we also take care of the small states with less population. Think about it though. Think about how our government's set up now. You should have an idea of what that is, and if not, we deal with it in lesson 3. So here we go. There's a compromise. For those of you who haven't heard it, a compromise is basically the idea that everybody involved is going to get a little bit of what they want, but everyone involved is going to lose out on something they want. So there's a compromise between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, and it's called the Great Compromise because had this compromise not been met, America as we know it would not exist. So what they've done is they came to the conclusion that a state, regardless of its size, regardless of its population, is going to get 2 representatives, and they're going to be senators. So they're going to have 2 representatives in Senate that speak for that state. Every state gets 2. But they're also going to have a House of Representatives, where every state gets a certain number of people talking for it based on how many people live in that state. So the states with most people get the most representation. Laws have to go through both of those. What that's going to mean is that it's good for states that are small, they have an equal voice. It's good for states with lots of people, they get a bigger voice in some ways. So it's as close to a perfect compromise as we can really think of. Some people aren't happy about it, other people aren't happy about it, but they're all willing to live with it. And that's lesson 2. Everything about lesson 2 is about this great compromise. There's some horrible ones in there. There's the idea of the 3/5 compromise, which is basically the southern states saying, we're not going to let slaves count as people, but when it comes to our representatives, our power in the government, we're going to let our slaves count as people. And the North doesn't want to let them do that because they don't want to give the Southern states too much power, even at this early venture. They're not ready to give the Southern states that much. They don't want the Southern states to be able to say slavery is allowed all the way across the country. So the Northern states are trying to control the Southern states by not letting them count their slaves. Because if they had counted the slaves, then they would have had too much power and the North wouldn't have been able to stop it eventually. All right, so that puts us into lesson 3. Lesson 3 is basically going to tell us, how do we build the Constitution? What goes into it? And the first thing that goes into it is a couple guys who are philosophers. For those of you who don't know, a philosopher is somebody that tries to figure out why the world is the way the world is. Not through science exactly, although science plays into it, but through mental exercises. So one of the most famous philosophical quotes you've probably ever heard is, "I think, therefore I am." That was a guy named Descartes, and what he was saying was, I know I'm real because I'm thinking. No one else can be thinking for me. I don't know what's going on in the world outside of my brain. I don't know if things are real or fake or if I'm asleep and dreaming, but I know I am real because I'm thinking. Now, what the founding fathers, what George Washington and Hamilton and Franklin and basically all these guys that are involved in the writing of the Constitution are looking at are two guys. One named John Locke and one named Montesquieu. John Locke is going to believe that people in general need to be protected by the government, that the government's entire job is to make sure that people's rights are protected, and any government that fails to do that needs to be gotten rid of. Montesquieu is going to believe that laws are the supreme rule of the land, that without laws, people are going to devolve into anarchy. So Montesquieu and Locke inform and influence the founding fathers. They're going to be fundamental to how we build the Constitution. Now, what's going to happen is the Constitution is going to set up the form of government that we live under today. And there's going to be some changes as time goes on, obviously, but the idea is that, well, it's pretty close to the same. It's pretty close to what they intended. The first idea that they set up here is this federalist government, a federalism government. And what that means is that there are 2 levels of government. You've got your top level. This is the national government. This is set in Washington, D.C. This is the idea that this is the place that makes decisions for the entire country. Every state, everything underneath the federal government. But then you've got smaller governments, and those governments are every state's government. Every state is responsible for making laws and decisions for the people inside their own state. Examples of that now include drug laws. They include the way that people have to apply for unemployment. They include the way that workers have to be treated by the people that they work for. So Arkansas is called a right to work state, meaning that if a boss doesn't like you, he can pretty much fire you for any reason. So when you get out of here and you go to work for the first time, if your boss doesn't like you, he might just be able to fire you for any reason. There are things that he can't fire you for, that the federal government says he's not allowed to fire you for. You can't be fired for your religion, your gender, your skin color. You can't be fired for the language that you speak, as long as you can do your job. But if your boss just looks at you and decides, I don't like your face, I don't like your tattoos, I don't like this or that about you, fired. And there's not really much you can do about it. And that's an Arkansas decision. All right, so 3 branches of the government in this federalist system, and pretty much every state follows this model. There's the legislative branch. The legislative branch makes and writes laws. The executive branch, this is the person that's in charge. President Trump is the head of the executive branch on the national government. Asa Hutchinson is the head of the executive branch in the Arkansas government. And then finally, the judicial branch. So these are the judges. These are the people that tell us if what we're doing is legal or not, depending on the Constitution and the rules. All of these guys, all of these branches, they're checks and balances to each other. So the executive branch can't do something that the legislative branch is supposed to do. If they do, the judicial branch stops them. If the executive branch goes crazy and starts doing crazy stuff, it's the job of the legislative and the judicial branch to stop the executive branch from doing it. That's why when we talk about the president is not allowed to do certain things, we can say that with some confidence in America, because the president is not allowed to do certain things. If he acts bad enough, they can get rid of him. Now, there's one last major compromise that has to be made before they're willing to ratify the Constitution. To ratify is to approve. Before the states are willing to ratify the Constitution. And that major change is the Bill of Rights. So several states say we will not ratify the Constitution. We will not support it unless you put in this Bill of Rights and you guarantee that every citizen in America, regardless of what state they're in, is going to have certain liberties and protections. That they're going to have the right to free speech because they don't want them to get Stamp Act again. That they're going to have the right to a freedom of religion. That they're going to be able to bear arms just in case the government ever goes bad, like King George's in England did. That they're going to be able to not make soldiers live in people's houses, because people got really salty about that when that happened. And you read about how that worked for people, that soldiers were basically taking advantage, getting fed, treating people poorly. People didn't want to live with that. And once they assume and agree to this Bill of Rights, the Constitution is ratified. We formed a more perfect union. It's not perfect, but it's better than it was under the Articles of Confederation. That is what our entire chapter is going to be about. So that's what we're studying. We'll go into it more in depth later. I hope this is useful for you. Remember, this will be in your classroom. Go back through it as many times as you need. Bye.